Good afternoon, everybody. This is Nathaniel Provencio, and with my very best friend in the whole world, Dr. Eric Worster. What's going on, Doc? How you doing,
What's
man?
up, Nathaniel? Thanks for that intro. Great to see you, pal.
So we have got Dr. James Lane on the Community Connection. Now, so here we were just chatting a little bit before the show. The last time I was in a Zoom space with Dr. James Lane, it was like around March 13th, I think, 2020, and the whole world just went, just I don't know, COVID out, right? And all the associate superintendents of Virginia are just like, we're all deer in the headlights going, what the heck is going on? What are we doing? We were all hired as instructional leaders, and now we got to worry about HP, PPE, and ventilation and mask and all this stuff, and what virtual pivot. If I heard the word pivot, if I had $1, James, for every time I heard that damn word pivot, I would be a millionaire. But anyway, the world comes back together. Dr. James Lane is on the Community Connection. How you doing, sir?
I'm glad to be with you guys. Looking forward to the conversation today, and certainly was honored to be the state superintendent, and look forward to talking about how we can continue to make our schools better.
Absolutely. If we can crack this code on this show, this is the show where we're going to crack the code, right? Dr. Worster, this is the show.
So, Dr. Lane, let's start with where you began. What was your first job in education? What got you into education?
Yeah, so I started my career in Durham, North Carolina. I went to school as a music major, trumpet major, and played jazz and thought I was going to play music for a living, and was out on the road playing with bands. And, of course, I've been with my wife for a few years at that point, and we were starting to think about getting married and thought, you know what, if I'm going to have a family and I'm going to, all of those type of things, let me see this teaching thing out. And so applied for my first job in Durham, North Carolina as a band director at a middle school called Rogers Hurry Year-Round Middle School. Kind of a crazy story about it. The school had gotten to the point that it was so low performing as a sixth grade center, decided to close the school as a traditional sixth grade center and reopen the school as a year-round magnet school in Durham. And so I got hired in kind of that rehashing of the staff as they transitioned the purpose of the school to be a full middle school. And my first job was in, a year-round model. And I'm a huge proponent of year-round models. I enjoyed it when I was a teacher, and it allowed me to continue my music career. So I had 5-6 weeks in the summer I could play music. I had 3 weeks in October, 3 weeks over the holidays, 3 weeks in March, and so I took that job. Started a band program with 25 kids in it, and taught there for about 4 or 5 years. And by the time I left that school, over half the kids in band, over half of the kids in the school were in the band program. They had won, regional competitions. And honestly, as I think back on all the other really cool things I've been able to do, my favorite job I've ever had was being that band director right there in Durham. And one of the things I tell this story a lot. I don't follow some of my former students on social media and all that and tell them until they are in a career. And so I've been able to reconnect with, they're all adults now.
Yeah.
Been able to reconnect with them all these years later. And it's amazing to me how many of them are working in the music industry. Some are DJs, some are producers, some are, jazz musicians, others are band directors. In fact, the middle school that I taught at, we fed into the high school. The band director of that high school is now one of my former students. And so I just really think back on those first years of my career with a lot of fondness, for sure.
Man, I love that.
Yeah.
James, I want to put you on the spot. Why don't we do year-round schools? I think that'd be great. Why don't we do them?
We do have year-round schools in Virginia, and Hopewell is probably the most notable. Where I think, if it's not all of their schools, a large majority of the schools in Hopewell. I mean, it's a small school district. In Chesterfield, we piloted a couple models. I think Bellwood is still year-round. So there have been grants and other things for folks to explore it, and it's out there. Ultimately, the calendar that everybody's come to expect over a long time with longer summers, or at least in today's age, parents still prefer that. I think that it's important to work with your community and make sure that your community will support any major schedule change like that. And a few districts have tried it and gotten some community support. But I think it's important that if we're going to have the long summers in lieu of year-round, of course, support that schedule as well. We need to make sure we're continuing to activate students through the summer, and we're not seeing a lot of learning loss during those long time periods. But it's been cool to watch some of these innovative models proliferate. They're not for every community, but where they're being successful, I love to see it.
Dr. Worster, I would, and and Dr. Lane, I would even say that every school system has a year-round school system, except some are more successful than others. You name me a schools district that doesn't have summer school, right? I mean, they all have summer school, but then what happens? You get, this is another problem. Summer school has been pervasive in American school system, and I think it does not do what it intends to do. And I think like that district that you just talked about, Hopewell, and some of those school districts that have made that commitment. An urban school like Philadelphia has been doing this for a long time. There's a lot of urban centers that do this. I mean, I want the student, and who goes to summer school, right? The students that need the most help. And then often it's not the best and brightest teachers that are helping those students. It's not. And so that's an interesting point, Dr. Worster. I don't know if you have some slight feedback on that. That's just my editorial opinion.
I think it's a difference between a continuity of instruction throughout the whole year with just more pause points versus a intense short-term intervention, which is what summer school is. So I think I would not call that a year-round model by any stretch, versus the ones that do that, where it's just more continuous learning and less time for learning loss. Dr. Lane, can you weigh in?
I think that's right. I will say, my kids are on a traditional calendar, and we're just coming out of summer and into the new school year, and my kids really appreciated the break. Now, as a parent that's super educationally focused, or we keep our kids learning through the summer,
of course you do,
engaging activities and all of those kind of things. And I think that's the key is whether it's mandatory summer school for kids that failed, or whether it's more of an engaging summer school for kids that want enrichment, offering options is the key. But I go back to, it really comes down to engaging with your community, making sure your community is supportive of what you're doing. But I will say, when we tried year round, in Rogers Herd down in Durham, and then in the couple of school districts here in Virginia, it's important, if you're going to do a year-round calendar, that you may have more of that continuous time throughout the year. But those 3-week, we call them intersessions, those 2 sessions, there's a lot of parents that can't provide that type of childcare that intermittently for that short period of time. So you got to be really thoughtful about the plan. It's not easy. And what I found is the best models have the kids that need extra help, those type of supports, but they also pair that with the enrichment and other, even for the young kids, even childcare type opportunities, to make sure you're not significantly disrupting parents. And ultimately, having, if you're, whether you're a superintendent or assistant superintendent, thinking about schedules, and if you're thinking about year round, it's certainly something you're going to have a deep conversation with your community. And I always had this belief that, if 80% of your community isn't in on what you're trying to do, you're probably running uphill a little bit. And so it takes a long time to develop that level of support. And so, don't go into it without a lot of planning and a lot of really critical conversations. So as you guys think about that, you asked me about my teaching experience. Did either of you have innovative models like that, or what were your subject areas? I'm somewhat curious.
I don't know about innovative stuff. I think sometimes maybe in education we try to innovate way too much. I think complexity leads to confusion. I just think we need to keep things more simple than we're trying to do it right now. And Dr. Worship, I think we agree on something. And like some of the most innovative schools are the most simple schools. I mean, there's simplicity in results. And I think that there is, we just had this fascinating guest on, Stephen Wilson, who talks about a lot of our schools are just trying to over-engineer what school means. And listen, I'm all about advocacy. I think the most innovative thing I ever did as a school leader in Virginia, I wouldn't call it innovative, it was trying to empower those that we served. I wanted to empower our students. I wanted to empower our parents, and I definitely wanted to empower our staff. But I had to be very mindful not to become a school of where SEL stuff, which I'm not saying it's not important, but like all these other factors that don't have anything to do with learning is like taking over learning. Like, we still have to keep things simple. Learning is our bottom line in our public schools. Now, it might be art learning, it might be music learning, it might be our academics, but I don't know, man. I think that the most I don't know, maybe in thinking about the schools that I served, the schools that were innovative in their simplicity were the ones that were actually getting results. Anyway, I don't know if that makes sense. Dr. Worster, that's a good question.
You got me nodding a lot, Nathaniel.
I did, man. I thought you were going to sleep. I don't know what was going on.
No. Dr. Lane, to answer your question for me, I think the most innovative opportunity I had was I got to open the only K-8 school in the county where I live in Virginia. So that was a unique experience, and I loved it. And it was a great school, a great community. Like you said, the K-8 model might not be for everyone, but just having a continuity of admin, continuity of instructional methodology, continuity of vision. I think was really powerful. Middle school can be a tough time, and I don't think we experience that shift and loss that sometimes you can have from fifth to sixth. So I love that.
Yeah, it's a good
Yeah,
question. Yep.
those
Yep.
transitions are interesting. I was thinking about what Nathaniel said about schools are always trying to be on the edge of innovation and all of that. And one of the things I often talk about is I think sometimes we're overthinking what innovative means, and sometimes maybe even more detrimental is folks are very focused on being on top of the new thing that's happening in schools. And so,
Mm.
what I often push leaders on is innovative to me is defined as something that's newer, sure, but it's actually got to be better. And a lot of things that are painted as newer are not better, and then
Mm.
those initiatives end up failing. And so it's really important that as you're thinking about a new initiative, whether it be year-round schools or curriculum enhancement or something like that, make sure it's actually better, because that's ultimately what it's about, right? Serving our students and making sure we're giving them a better experience in schools. So for me, innovation is about newer and better, and I say that over and over again. And I would just caution leaders that are always thinking about trying to do the newest thing until you've really assessed whether it's going to make a positive impact on kids.
Yep.
I agree. I think a chase for efficiency ends up creating chaos in a lot of our schools. I see that so much. And we'll get into this too, James, because you are at all these different levels, and I'm still fascinated with your origin story, right? I mean, you're a middle school band teacher, and then you're the state superintendent of Virginia. So before we get into some of these other kinds of I still you got some gaps you got to fill, bro. We got to close the gap with your origin story. So give us the 30-second version of how you went from leading a band program, an effective band program, to leading an effective school district.
Yeah, well, I'll be honest, about my third year teaching, like a lot of us, the principal came to me and said, "Hey, I think you'd be, a great principal one day."
Mm.
And so, being in Durham, North Carolina, we had a really cool opportunity where NC State actually offered a cohort right there in the school district for folks that wanted to be principals. Y'all probably have similar experiences with GMU or VCU or even
Right.
in
Yep.
Virginia. We have a lot of those going on. And so I just started to dabble, take a few classes, let me see what I think. And I was part of this amazing turnaround story where we were one of the lowest performing schools in the district, and here we are 3-4 years later, we're one of the higher performing schools in the district. And Durham has unique challenges, to be honest. And I started thinking, okay, I see the impact that I'm having in my classroom. How can I make sure that every classroom that the kids go to in my school has that same impact? And I thought, you know what, maybe it is right for me to become a principal. And then I became a principal, and I talk about this in the book, which I know we're going to talk about later. And we had an unbelievable first year in my principalship where there were some subject areas with pass rates in the 50s. And 1 year later, we jumped that to the 90s. And I can talk about some of that later. But, the superintendent at the time, said, "Hey, how can we take some of what you're doing and proliferate this around the district?" And of course, I helped that district at that time, but it got me thinking, you know what? It's time for me to be a superintendent, because much like that principal transition, I started to see, okay, there are concepts that we can put in place in our schools around how we organize our school from a leadership standpoint, how we engage our students in learning, that will be applicable in any school. It's time for me to be a superintendent so that every school in my district can have that impact that I thought my school was having. And I'll be frank, you mentioned state superintendent. I ended up being a district superintendent in 3 districts in Virginia. Middlesex, which had 1,200 kids about the time I was there. I think that's smaller than my daughter's elementary school.
Yeah, it is.
When she was in elementary school. And eventually went to Goochland, which was kind of seen as an innovative beacon at the time, and then ended up in Chesterfield, 70,000 kids or almost 70,000 kids, and just a really amazing experience to see leadership from another lens. And I'd been in rural, I'd been in suburban, I'd been in urban down in Durham, and I thought, you know what, maybe there's something I can do to help schools around Virginia. And that ultimately led me to have the conversation I had with the governor about becoming state superintendent. But it's been an amazing journey. Another thing I talk about all the time, and I mentioned in the book, is there's a phrase I use, and it's probably a version of somebody else's quote, but
Sure.
essentially that, opportunity is the intersection of luck and skill.
I think that was Pitbull. I think the rapper Pitbull said that.
Yeah, he probably said that. That's what.
Yeah.
I don't know who it was, but in any event, as I think about how each of these steps happened for me, some of it was frankly luck, being in the right place to have the right conversation with the right people and the right job that they felt like, lifted me up to be ready for that next step. But then it was about really being ready that, when I got into that seat in Goochland, in Chesterfield, at the state, that, I had enough leadership acumen that I could make a difference. And so, folks ask me all the time, well, how do I get to the next step in my career? Well, the first thing you got to do is be great where you are, and then the next thing you have to do is wait for the right moment, because just getting the next job is almost the easier part. Being successful in the next job is the hard part, but those opportunities will come if you're great where you are.
So we had Atif Karnai on our show, and fun dude, great dude, very humble, and we were like, from the classroom, you were like, and he's like the Secretary of Ed, in Virginia. That might have been around your time too, right, James?
Yeah, Atif was the Secretary of Ed when I was the state chief. Yep.
So if I wanted to be the secretary or the state superintendent, do I just call the governor and say, let's have a conversation, or like something happened in there? And I think this is like behind the scenes stuff that a lot of people don't really know, because like, it's like, how do you even like go about that? Because even I've met some fantastic superintendents that would have been fantastic at that level. But like, how was this like a political thing? I'm just curious, because I have no clue. I have no clue how this works.
Yeah, well, I'll be honest in that I generally tried to stay apolitical, because I felt like I was serving Virginia, and
That's right.
I didn't think of myself as being overly aligned to in any one ideology by any means. But certainly in Virginia, there are requirements to be the state superintendent in the laws of Virginia. So you have to meet those minimum requirements, but most superintendents meet those requirements. But the you are ultimately appointed by the governor, and so when you are the state superintendent, one of the things I don't know if this is true, but I felt like because it is partly a constitutional officer. You're answering to the legislature, which it is bipartisan on any day. Certainly there are majorities that might be one way or the other. So you have to answer to the legislature. You have to answer to the state board. To a certain degree, you have to answer to the Secretary of Education. You have to answer to the governor, and so when the governor is making the decision about who's going to be state chief, there are a lot of factors at play. I'm sure they're vetting that with folks across each of the constituencies. And then there's probably conversations with teachers groups and parent groups and administrator groups. And so, I think that the governor ultimately is going to make the choice around someone that they think is aligned to the priorities of their administration, can act on what they hope to see done. And then, of course, what I didn't expect when I took the role was that we would have all these other things that nobody expected happen, which you referenced earlier.
That's right. It wasn't the interview. It was like, can James lead us through a worldwide pandemic? Yeah, he's the guy. Yeah.
not something I thought of on day one, but ultimately for me, I think that having strong leadership skill is the key to being state superintendent. You're leading an agency. You're setting the tone for education statewide. You're constantly, it's more of a policy and regulatory job. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a very different job than the superintendency, because you're basically setting forth the rules that govern education in Virginia. Some of it is enacted by the legislature, and then you might have regulatory pieces that come from that, and then other pieces are being decided by the state board. So in some ways it's political, but not from like an ideology standpoint or political party. It's understanding the politics of all the constituencies that support Virginia and trying to find a path forward that the most Virginians possible can be supportive of.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, listen, you were the right man for the job at the right time, and so I applaud you for those efforts. So I'm sure you've gotten a lot of affirmation, but let me be the first to affirm you today that you did a hell of a job during a hell of a time. So very good.
No, thank you for saying that. I mean, for me, you heard me talk about impact as I went through these steps. It never was about getting to a job. For me, it was about making a difference for kids in Virginia, kids and families in Virginia. And honestly, it was an honor to be the state superintendent in Virginia. And I certainly an experience that I'll think fondly about the rest of my life.
I want to pull two threads before we go into your book, which will be next. But first thread, and they're both kind of music related. You said you were in a band. What bands got you interested in music to begin with?
Ooh, that's a great question. So we have a history of trumpet players in our family. My dad was a trumpet player. My wife was also a trumpet major at UNC Chapel Hill, so that's where we met. University of National Championships, UNC, right? Right. No. In any event, but then my son is now a trumpet player. My daughter is a trumpet player. Frankly, most of my friends from college were trumpet players. So, it was somewhat a foregone conclusion that I was going to be a band kid before I picked up my horn in fourth grade. But when I think about the bands that I listened to, it was really an eclectic mix. I loved Earth, Wind, and Fire. The loud, powerful horns, the trumpet players.
You like
Right.
Tower of Power too, I bet.
Oh,
Right.
I love Tower of Power. I mean,
Tower of Power, man. Come on, Eric, you don't know about Tower of Power.
I do not. I know the song September.
yeah. Well, that's Earth, Wind, Fire, but so Very Hard to Go. There's just so many Tower of Power songs. The cleanest horns of all time. So go and listen to it.
Yeah, look at that on Spotify, Worcester. Tower of Power. Oh, that's right. You don't have Spotify. That's
Yeah.
right.
Chicago was another band, but as I got further
70s Chicago.
into my music career, I got pretty serious about jazz. Loved Miles Davis, Clifford Brown, Lee Morgan are kind of famous trumpet players. Of course, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, and when I got to college, I decided to get super deep in the jazz world and was studying those musicians and playing gigs. I mean, I can remember there were times in college where I probably had a different Franklin Street's the name of the street at UNC, which is why I joked about UNC because that's really where my music career started. Just playing in Franklin Street. Monday night we'd be at the Groundhog Tavern, Tuesday West End Wine Bar, and all those kind of things, and just kind of grew my career just playing jam sessions almost. And that's where I really got excited about music and jazz for me. Really, in addition to just becoming a better musician, taught me a lot of skills. It taught you improvisation. You get, asked a tough question in the faculty meeting that you weren't expecting. You've got to be ready to improvise, right? I mean, the answer has to be the truth, but you certainly got to be on your toes. And jazz really trains your mind around that. And so, later on, I got into a lot of rock bands. I loved Radiohead back in the day.
There we go.
There we go. Good answer. Drop the
Yeah.
mic. Yay.
Got into
Very
hip
good.
hop. I loved Jay-Z and got into country. I mean, for whatever reason, I can't put Morgan Wallen down right now, right? But so for me,
That's pretty good.
I never chose one genre. I just tried to listen to everything and soak it in. And then when I was coming up with that lick while I was improvising, I could quote a country song as fast as I'd quote a rock song or all of that. And it just was making sure I was ready for any genre that came about.
I love it.
James, any specific Radiohead songs that stand out to you?
I mean, I love Kid A. I like when you say the word Radiohead, I immediately think of that opening piano chord, like C, A flat, G, F, C, or whatever. I think that's the right note.
Everything in its right place. Is that Kid A?
Everything in its right place is the
Yeah.
first song, Kid A. That's right.
Yeah.
Love that record. I
Well,
love
the national anthem, is it the national anthem?
Yep.
that's third song on the record.
That has killer horns at the end of it.
It
does, it
You
does.
wouldn't expect, Radiohead to have a horn section.
Yeah,
so-
improvising and
Yeah, it's great.
The bends. I mean, you gotta love some of their hits like Creep and all that. But yeah, no, love Radiohead. Yeah.
Great. Love those
So,
answers.
here's a little transition. You ready? You ready, team?
Ready.
Here's a transition. Got a musical question for you, Dr. James Lane. How many major notes are there in music?
Major
Major notes.
There's 12 chromatic notes that make up the chromatic scale.
How many basic notes?
But if you play a major scale, there are 8 notes in a major scale.
Are there 7 diatonic notes?
Well, so if you play a major scale of 7 notes, the 8th note is the original note at the bottom of the scale. So I think that's fair to say.
So 7. There's 7 notes, right?
Right, in a major scale, that's fair.
And in the book, Leading with Laser Focus, I got 7 strategies. Look at that, Dr. Worcester. Huh? That's why this is the community connection. I just made a freaking connection. There are 7 strategies in this book to turn schools around. Is this a fair statement, Dr. Lane?
Well, certainly, I think there's a lot that goes into school turnaround. That's a good transition right there. But
That's jazz. See, I didn't even have that scripted, Worcester. That's
the
jazz, brother.
improvisation. Yeah. We're trading fours now. But no, as I thought about school improvement from my perspective, what I saw over years of leading schools and seeing several schools turn around was that there are 7 essential steps that I thought about. This is not everything that goes into school improvement, but if I were a principal and a superintendent and someone asked me, how would you organize your school? How would you organize your district? Or what are some of the themes that consistently emerge when you see schools make that transition from low performing to high performing? I've, at least in my experience, seen these 7 steps happen over and over again. I'm happy to jump into what those are, but yes,
Let's do it, man. I've
there are
got
7 notes. Yes.
yeah, 7 notes, right? Well, it's just like even like on a trumpet. I always find the trumpet, and I got a trumpet. I was a crappy cornet trumpet player in middle school. I hated it. I didn't like it. I was a drummer, but I was like, let me just learn other instruments. And so I thought I could do the trumpet because like, how hard could it be? It's got 3 valves. It can't be hard. It's the hardest freaking thing I've ever done in my life, right? So, but but even with those 3 valves, right? You can make some magic happen, right? So, and all those different combinations. So imagine what we could do with these 7 things. I got strategic curriculum alignment. I've got relentless focus on people. I've got meaningful assessment, data-driven decisions, targeted interactions, purposeful collaboration, and intelligent technology integration. Did I get those right?
Those are the 7 steps. That's right.
All right, man. Let's see what we can do. So, strategic curriculum alignment. Let's jump right in. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so I tell a story in the book that I'm not necessarily delving into this chapter which curriculum you choose, because ultimately there are a lot of good curricula out there. I'm not going to pick one over the other for anybody.
Yep.
But what I know is that we've got to implement the curricula that we have to fidelity. And a lot of times, districts, and I'm not saying this is happening in your district or even any of the listeners' districts, but the district will roll out a curriculum. There's not a lot of training, and teachers are out there fending for themselves sometime. And so where I'm going in that chapter, honestly, is a couple ways. But this book is more about how to organize yourself for improvement, right? It's not how you're doing the PD on the curriculum and all that stuff. That's super essential.
Yeah.
But what I often found is that, we all have developed pacing guides and curriculum maps and all of these things. And let me caveat this with, like, I'm not suggesting, some of y'all probably remember this. Back in the day, there were times where, like, day 187, or there's not more than 180, day 177 of the curriculum map says you're supposed to be teaching this topic, and the superintendent walks in and you're not teaching day 177 stuff, you get in trouble.
That's right.
Nowhere near that. But more what I'm suggesting here is, as you plan your year as a teacher, of course, your district will have pacing guides and curriculum maps as well. Take a look at what's in the blueprint for your state's assessment. These are public documents, easily accessible. And quickly what you'll see is they're hinting at the percentage of time on the assessment that's spent on certain topics. Now, I'm not going to remember Virginia's blueprints or anything like that, but what I'll suggest is let's use an American history example here. Let's say that the blueprint spends 15% of its time on the American Revolution, and let's say it spends 5% of its time on the War of 1812, and it spends 10% of its time on the period between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, and it spends a bigger and heftier chunk on the Civil War. And of course, we split that in 2 in middle school. It's 1 year in high school, so use that analog how you want. And what I found is that sometimes our teachers were not thinking about how they balance their time around those topics to actually what's expected at the end of the year. And that you might find a teacher who is spending 20% of their time on, and I'm making this up, the War of 1812, when really that's only 5% of what's going to be expected of students. And maybe they're spending 5% of their time on the American Revolution. That's really like 15 or 20%. We ought to make sure that we're digging more deeply on the topics that the state has identified are the most important. Now, I'm not saying that's always the best way to approach curriculum, but if you want better student outcomes, you should be aligning what you're doing to what's expected from the state or the district or whoever that entity is. And so that's what we go into in that chapter and talk about a lot is, let's make sure that at least the teachers are knowledgeable of where the students are going to have to go the deepest on the assessment. Maybe we should spend more time going deep in the classroom on those topics.
Yeah.
James, you mentioned that in your book, right? Where you went into a classroom and the teacher was teaching War of 1812, and you're like, man, that's a phenomenal lesson. That's great. And then you went back a little bit later and they were still doing War of 1812, and you're like, okay, I'm not sure why we're still doing this.
The lesson lasted longer than the damn war.
Yes, probably. You mentioned the word assessment, and I want to jump to the assessment portion. I think it's always interesting what people do with that word and how they take it, but I thought you gave a pretty full-throated defense of the importance of statewide assessments.
Yeah, and in my book, I talk more about the common assessments that lead up to the state assessment. I mean, I've always been a believer that if you do good things 179 days a year, day 180, the test is going to be fine, right? But so, I've always been a believer that the journey is more important than the outcome. But what I know is you have to pay attention to those outcomes. One of the things about state assessment that, I think has gotten lost in narratives over the years is that these state assessments were intended to be diagnostic. Now, they end up being autopsies the way we deliver them, but the idea around all of this, around No Child Left Behind in 2001 was, hey, we're going to use these assessments to identify the schools that are struggling or even the students that are struggling. And then we're going to use the resources that we have to drive those resources to really turn those situations around. And, ultimately funding, budget cuts, everything that's happened over the last 25 years, the resources weren't always there to follow what we learned from those diagnostics. And so it turned more into an accountability issue than it did a diagnostic issue. Now, I think the accountability side of it's important because when a school is struggling, we've got to make sure that the students in that school are getting the experience that their parents expect for them.
Yep.
But, state assessment is really supposed to help us think about how we can drive school improvement and use it as a strategic tool. Now, what I talk about in the book is I actually think the formative or more interim type of assessments or even unit tests are way more informative because we can adjust instruction immediately at the moment that we see what's happening with a student. And I talk about this in the book that in my first school as principal, it was a really small school, 300 kids. I didn't even have an assistant principal, right? I was the only administrator in the school.
Been there, brother.
And what I talked about was we're in a school that's small enough that we can do this. Everyone in this school, from the custodian to the principal to the superintendent, should know exactly what happens when a student shows failure. And, we tried to activate on that. And that, the LASER acronym came from that because we created a period of the day that was called Learning Advancement Through Support, Enrichment, and Remediation. And the idea was that if a kid fails a unit test or has trouble in class or needs extra help or their parent calls and says they're not getting it, we know exactly how to respond to that student. And that was, at the time, I thought that was unique to small schools. And what I've learned over time is we can put those type of structures in place anywhere.
Yeah.
And so for me, the reason we have common assessment throughout the year, whether that's unit tests across the grade level or benchmark tests, as benchmarks have a negative connotation now. But the reason they have negative connotations is because we haven't always activated on that data to make a difference for kids. But if we're actually looking at that data and that data drives a new decision for the kid because of something that we learned about them, then it becomes extremely valuable. And with all the tech and everything else going on, we're going to get way more efficient at this. But ultimately, that's what it's about for me, that we have to have these moments in time where we can see how our kids are doing as a group, see which kids are the high flyers, see which kids are, learning and moving along at a consistent pace and which kids need the extra help. And ultimately, what we want to know as educators is what is the zone of proximal development for each kid, where we know, okay, this kid is ready to learn this material, this kid's way ahead of that material, and this kid's way behind that material. And we know which kids are way behind, then we can activate enrichment and intervention experiences to catch that kid up.
Great.
James,
Dr. Lane, you mentioned No Child Left Behind, the much derided No Child Left Behind. I want to take us back to those days. Nathaniel, remember AMO, AYP? Remember those?
I remember SOL in Virginia stands for something out of luck. No, Standards of Learning.
That's part of it.
I think it's Standards of Learning.
I read something recently that said back in the No Child Left Behind days, the difference between our high achievers and low achievers was less than it is now. And looking at the recent NAEP scores, you just see scores decreasing and an increasing fracture. So I wonder if it isn't time to look back at that early 2000 time and think that some of those things were going right.
Yeah. I mean, I think always looking back at what was done successfully in the past is a great lesson for what's going on in the future. I mean, for someone that's been, adjacent to education for, well over 25 years now, schools are very different today than they were in 2001. I won't go into all of those things, but, the NAEP scores we're seeing today, I don't think that anyone would disagree, are leading me to believe this is one of the most concerning times for these, standardized outcomes for students, which I believe should be driving our thinking on school improvement. A lot of things happened during COVID. After I left being state superintendent, I went and served as the acting assistant secretary at the U.S. Department of Education, and I ran the American Rescue Plan ESSER funds as part of my office in the Office of Elementary Education. And in that role, I had the opportunity to engage with a lot of researchers that were doing research on NAEP, doing research on state assessment scores, doing research on how ESSER dollars were being used. And I got to know a guy named Tom Kane, and I quote him a lot. and I hope I'm not oversimplifying what he said. And Tom's probably written 20 more articles that I haven't read that may have updated some of this. But when we were in those first few years of the American Rescue Plan, what we found is that almost every school district in America had a tutoring type program. But the problem was they were not doing it on the scale necessary to recover kids fast enough. And so what happened is Tom found that if we wanted to catch kids up by the time that ESSER ended, kids that were behind, we're going to need like 100 hours of tutoring a year. And the average tutoring program in America was giving kids about 30 hours a year. Well, you think about 4 or 9 weeks, that means that kids were getting about 1 hour a week of tutoring when really they needed about 3 hours a week of tutoring. And so what we learned is that schools probably had the right strategies. They just weren't doing it on scale. And so, thinking back to Eric's question about, where we were in 2001, well, we weren't coming off the heels of a global pandemic. We weren't trying to get kids, back not only to where they were, but where they could have been were we not dealing with COVID. And then, we're now learning that maybe our school districts were not aggressive enough on the tutoring side early enough, which has led to a longer road to getting NAEP scores back where they need to be. So now those ESSER dollars are gone, right? But the issues of recovering students remain. And so it's going to be really important that we continue to invest in making sure our teachers and our tutoring programs are robust enough to get kids on track to be successful in life and in school.
I'm going through the 7. I wish we had a little bit more time to get through everything, but I'm over here making connections. You talked about the importance of strategic curriculum alignment. And then Eric kind of delved into the meaningful assessment, which then I think would then, have better data-driven decisions, right? That's one of them. But then also you got in here purposeful collaboration. And, just to talk a little bit about it, and I like the fact, James, that you mentioned about, the tutoring. I could be wrong with this, but like just saying a kid needs more tutoring, I don't think equates to more effective growth. I think it's got to be the right person. And what I've seen is that, especially coming out of ESSER, is that you had all these magical programs that these publishers just came out of the woodwork, right? That Adam Smith's invisible hand of programs and products and and online tools just came everywhere, but it wasn't the right people delivering those interventions. And so like I don't know, I could be wrong, but like, when you talked about the 30 hours, I would say, but who was delivering those 30 hours of interventions, or 100 hours? Give me the heart surgeon that's going to do the heart surgery, and not someone off the street that we're just slinging programs. So, but I go to that purposeful collaboration, and I think that it's such a strong element in your 7, because Dr. Worcester and I talk about collective teacher efficacy all the time. And so like, if I'm going back with that history teacher that's teaching the War of 1812 for 7 damn months, was everyone on that team also teaching the War of 1812 for 7 months? Or was he being a deviant because that's just what they wanted to do? So I think when it comes to strategic curriculum alignment, you got to have a team to help to make sure that we're aligned with that. When it comes to meaningful assessment, I think if it's common formative assessment, it's got to be commonly created, right? And then when it comes to data-driven decisions, is that team making the decisions? And then I think that also will lead to targeted interventions if that team are making those decisions. And then it goes back. I'll even throw this other one. If the principal has a relentless focus on people and also on teams, maybe some of these 7 can take place. I'm curious with your thoughts about that.
No, I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head. You referenced the 7 steps, and you're right. There are a couple themes there. I'll delve into purposeful collaboration a little bit, but let me jump in on this, relentless focus on people. Anyone that's ever worked for me has heard me say, if you're going to be maniacal about anything, be maniacal about the people we put in front of our kids. And whether that's the tutor, the cafeteria partner, the person that cleans our classrooms, the principal, all the way to the superintendent, it's our role as leaders in the school. We get to choose the people that work in our schools largely. If you're the principal, there may be panels, but ultimately the final decision rests with the principal, or, and when it comes to principals, the superintendent. And what I have found is that it is essential to not only make sure that you're making the best hiring decisions, but ultimately, I've not found the magic interview process. We we would put in really rigorous, tactics to try to find the very best people. But Jim Collins and a subsequent book to Good to Great, which you've already read,
Yeah.
but he really digs on this, and he talks about there's no magic interviewing technique. You never really know someone until you've worked with them. And so in that context, it's really important that when we work with an individual, that we're supporting them, helping them to get better, investing our time in them. As a principal, and even superintendent, I try to spend a ton of time in classrooms so that I could be a guide and not just a boss or all of these things. But you also have to be really honest with people about their performance and their growth and the ability that they have in working with kids. And I've walked into a lot of schools that had very well-intentioned adults working with kids that the principal would tell you, I know that teacher is not engaging our students, or I know that person is not able to really get their kids to grasp this concept. And the first tactic as a leader is, okay, let's get them some training, let's get them trained up. But you can't afford multiple years of low performance. I mean, there's all kinds of research that if you were experienced 2 low performing individuals as your teacher for 2 years in a row, you
forget
can
about
never recover from that your entire educational career. So we have a moral responsibility to our kids to hold high standards for our people. And what I found is that when you finally made that tough decision, if it, after all the steps, all the improvement, everything you could do to make that person better, if they didn't make it, ultimately, when we moved on, people would come back to me with such appreciation. I wondered when someone was finally going to address this situation or this teammate, because they saw that maybe it wasn't helping them in the way that they wanted to. And oftentimes these lower performing individuals are bringing the team down and the other teachers in the school. And so there's such an appreciation to having a high standard. And the other thing I know is that people really appreciate working on a winning team.
Yep.
Yeah.
Knowing that that your boss knows that you're doing a great job, and offering praise and all that goes side by side with, making sure that when people aren't stepping up to that high standard, that you're going to do something about it. Your parents expect that, the kids expect that, the other teachers expect that. And so that's what being maniacal about people is to me. And then once you have the right people, then it's activating them on a strategy together. This whole concept of everyone knowing what happens to a kid, well, that goes into that chapter about purposeful collaboration. That when teachers sit down, we all talk about PLCs, professional learning communities, all these phrases. But if you're not actually doing anything in those meetings that are making a difference for kids, then you're just having team meetings and you're calling it PLCs.
Right.
But
which is blasphemy, which is PLC blasphemy.
Absolutely.
Nathaniel is very passionate about PLCs.
James, you ever been in a band with a really crappy drummer?
Everybody's been in a band with a really crappy drummer, but I've been lucky. I've had some really great drummers.
I'm sure you have. But what does that drummer do? And I'm picking on drummers because I'm a drummer. What does that drummer do to the entire band?
Oh, I mean, they drive the tempo. I mean,
they drive the tempo, right? You ever been in a band with a really crappy trombone player who's just like, what is this guy doing? What's going on, right?
So here's the question, Nathaniel.
What's that?
If you need a drummer, and this is the question I think that we're facing in education.
Fire the drummer and get a rhythm machine.
If every band, there you go. There's your solution. If every band needs a drummer, how do we get more drummers? Because sometimes I think that's what people face. And James, I agree with you. People want to know you have a standard, and they want to know you will hold people to that standard. I think that the calculus people are doing is who else is out there. If this is somebody who's performing on an average level, is there somebody else out there? So how do we get more people, more of our best and brightest, to want to become teachers?
Well,
yeah.
I mean, that's a great question. It's something I think about every day. I was reading a Forbes article a couple of years ago, and I've talked about this before. We do have a teacher shortage. Like, that's super clear. Anyone that works in our schools knows that. But we don't have a shortage of humans, right? So when we have a teacher shortage, that means that we are not providing the incentives necessary for enough people to want to teach. So I'll go into other tactics that are important, but let's be clear that pay is a central issue to the teacher shortage, and we're gonna have to get to the point where pay is comparable to what it takes to convince someone to leave other fields and be this field. I read something the other day also that I think there are more certified teachers in Michigan that are no longer teaching than the number
Wow.
of teachers in the state, right? And
That's
so,
fascinating. Never heard that fact. And I don't disagree with that whatsoever.
and again, don't know if it's true, but I read that. But that shows you how many people are leaving at that third year, at that fifth year, because they want growth opportunities. They want to buy a home for their family, and they're worried about whether they'll be able to do that in a 30 or 40-year career in education. So pay is essential. But what we know is the second piece is something that those of us working day to day have a little bit more control over, and that is the conditions in our schools. We're overtaxing our teachers with bureaucracy sometimes, extra requirements, reporting, all of this, extra meetings. And as a principal, it's essential for you to reduce the burden as much on your teachers. But in that same vein of principal support that we know is in the research, is also teachers feeling supported by their principal, that when they have an issue with a student that needs extra help, or maybe even a discipline issue in the school, that they know that their administrator will work with them on that issue to resolve them. And that I always hesitate to say support them with parents, because sometimes our educators are wrong when it comes to a situation with a student. It's not 100% of the time, but where we know that our educators were right in trying to make a difference and hold kids to a standard, that the teachers know that they can come to you and know that you're gonna be supportive, and at the same time that your parents know that you're gonna be fair and look at all sides of the issue. And so that plays into it big time. And then I think the other factor that's at play in the teacher shortage is it's so much more rare for someone to work 30 years in the same job.
Right.
And more people are motivated by growth. Now, some of this goes with salary, sure, but I think that we've got to create structures where teachers don't have to feel like every day is going to be the exact same thing for the rest of their career, that there are chances to do something different, or work on a different grade level, or be the department chair, or go into administration and come back into the classroom. And that there are all types of ways that you can grow in your career. And we've tried career laddering and all that, and it's never really sustained.
Yeah.
But a large part of the reason that these more innovative ways of approaching teacher growth haven't sustained is because we haven't stuck with them from a funding standpoint. And then when the funding goes away, then the initiative goes away. But I think we're going to have to get smarter about how we can tier a 30-year career, so that teachers feel like they're growing every day in their career. That's
a great point. Managers manage people where they are. Leaders move people to where they didn't even know they could be.
Love it.
And I think, and that's a good one. I just made that up, right?
I like it.
Dr. Lane, I think we can talk to you for hours, but our time is coming short. 2 quick last questions. One, where can people find you?
So certainly on all the socials, if you go to LinkedIn, I think it's the LinkedIn /James F. Lane. I'm on Twitter and Instagram as @Dr. James Lane. And then certainly we have a website, laserfocus.education. Check us out there, and certainly reach out if you all ever need anything. I'm just here to help our schools be better.
Well, we're going to go down to Richmond. We're going to go to Gwar Bar, and we're going to talk about music, jazz, and school improvement. I like that. Eric, you ready?
I've never been to Gwar Bar, so I don't even know what it's like there.
We're going to go.
Last thing before we close out. What words of inspiration do you have for our educators and administrators and school leaders across the country?
Yeah. The biggest thing that I would say is, I don't even know it's a piece of inspiration. I just want to say thank you. That, I've worked in education for 25 years. I know how hard the job is every day, and in a lot of ways, every day it gets harder. But just know that there are leaders out there that appreciate you. The parents appreciate you. The other educators in your community appreciate you, and just know that we're behind you. Ultimately, and maybe this is the inspirational piece, if you remain your focus relentlessly on what's best for kids, we're always going to be doing the right thing. And so thank you for always keeping kids at the center of what we do.
Love it. Thank you.
Dr. James Lane, thank you so much, my man, for seeing and it's good to see you again, right? Good to see you again. And thank you so much for just honoring us with your symphony of excellence. Yeah, I like that. Thanks for joining us on the Community Connection. Take care.